Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do part 2 of chapter 9 from the Occult Investigator Real Cases from the Files of X Investigations book by Bob Johnson. This one titled The Cats Made Her Kill Herself. Last time we had left this chapter, it was going into more information associated with those strange cats, including the lead cat, one of them that was called Tailspring. Both of these cats, actually all of these cats, essentially having some kind of weird way of communicating with their previous owner, almost as if they were human-like, almost as if they were actually talking to her, and in some cases in an evil manner. So let's go ahead and we'll finish off this chapter. I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward, and I'd love to hear what your own thoughts are with regards to this so far illusions associated with these evil cats. So this is essentially how the chapter goes. The discovery puzzled Alexis, but interestingly did not seem to shock her. The revelation of the skeleton led us to the real reason that she suspected the animals had something to do with her aunt's death. She told us that her worries about the notebooks and recordings were only part of the bizarre story, and that her aunt had rumbled on about death and how her cats were going to transfer her soul so she could become one of the secret masters and join them as gods. For quite a while after Uncle Arnold passed away, I simply humored Aunt Phyllis. She would go on and on about the cats, each time adding a new member to her family. She said that she had to have a council of 9 cats to complete the task that would help her truly understand the universal mysteries. And of course, she would always talk about Tailspring, her favorite, whom she'd stroke on her lap and say that the two of them were joined in spirit and would never be apart. She would say, "Alexis, my dear, you must be aware of how felines have been magical creatures for eons. Just look at ancient Egypt and how they worship Bast, the cat-headed goddess. Even Leonardo da Vinci knew this. He said the smallest feline is a masterpiece." Alexis went on to tell us that Phyllis was quite the authority on the mysteries of cats, detailing to her that cats were so revered in ancient Egyptian culture that when a family cat died, the household members shaved their eyebrows and mourned the feline. Some even embalmed and mummified their dead companions. She said she had an ominous feeling that Phyllis had been experimenting with mummification in the event her cats should predecease her. As time went on, Phyllis had begun exhibiting more bizarre behavior and telling Alexis that the cats were not simply pets or companions, but were in fact her spiritual guides. A religious person all of her life, Phyllis had gradually turned away from her conventional faith, telling Alexis that her cats were the ultimate answer to life's mysteries, and she would sacrifice everything and anything to join them in the total bliss of their paradise. My natural response to Alexis' story was to ask if she advised her aunt to seek some psychological help. Oh yes, I was very discreet at first, telling her that she needed to talk to someone after Uncle Arnold died and that she needed a close human companion to fill the void. And she did see a therapist for about 6 months. The therapist reported to me that Aunt Phyllis was perfectly adjusted and could take care of herself just fine. Was this before or after she started talking about mummification and the talking cats, I asked. Well, it was before, but I did convince the therapist to pay a visit at a later date under the guise of having a friendly chat about her after her bizarre behavior began, but he reported back to me that she still seemed totally sane, Alexis said. At this point, we decided to turn in for the night and continue our investigation the next day. We'd also take the cat skeleton to our forensic specialist Paula to determine how old that cat was. It was nearly 4 a.m. when I was awakened out of a deep sleep by some clanging noises from the kitchen downstairs. I cautiously headed down the stairs and peeked over the banister to see who or what was in the kitchen. I was happy to see Sylvana's shapely outline by the sink. She was rinsing out a glass. My associate couldn't sleep and had decided to get a drink of juice. We pulled up a couple of chairs at the kitchen table and agreed that despite the fact that we'd spent nights in supposedly haunted houses and possessed establishments, it was rather strange to be in the ordinary person's home where we really didn't belong. At least in a house that is haunted, we're there to be helpers. Here we are not guests to help, but we are strangers. I don't feel the person has really left here yet, Robert. I still feel Phyllis's spirit is not gone, Savannah said in her best Czech psychic talk. I couldn't have agreed more. I thought maybe it was because the house still looked lived in or because it was so ordinary, but that feeling of being an intruder was prevalent. I got up to refill my glass of juice and I stopped dead in my tracks. I was glancing out the large kitchen window that looked into the dark backyard when I noticed two huge green eyes staring at me. At first I thought it was a reflection of something in the kitchen, perhaps a painting on the wall or a statue, but upon closer inspection I realized that a huge black cat was sitting on the patio table, peering directly into the kitchen at Silvana and me. I called to her, but she had already seen the animal looking in at us. Where did she come from? I asked Silvana. In what seemed like an instant, it was gone. We opened the patio door to see if we could get another glimpse, but the cat was nowhere in sight. Silvana and I had the same question. Was this Tailspring returning home? If so, at least Alexis would know. Our kitchen racket woke Alexis. Before we could summon her, she joined us in the kitchen. We told her what we saw and described the animal. From our description, Alexis deduced that it was in fact Tailspring returning home and said that it would be great if we could confirm this. Then there would be no legal confusion regarding the challenge to the will. I don't want people to think that I deliberately got rid of Tailspring to avoid the will, Alexis said. And so I grabbed the flashlight we used in the attic, telling Savannah and Alexis to follow me into the yard. Before I could open the patio door, we heard Tailspring howling a mournful meow. We couldn't see the cat, but we could hear a noise that sounded as though he was in terrible pain. It was a long, mournful cry that began as a typical meow and then stretched into a loud howling that sounded like the name Harold drawn out into two-syllable yodels. The bellow stopped us dead, and then things got worse. The single cry from Tailspring or whatever other cat was in the yard suddenly multiplied into a duet of howling cats. The duet quickly turned into a battle of catcalls, one louder than the other, crying into the early dawn. The two cries turned into three, then four, and then more than we could count. Within minutes, the entire yard was filled with what sounded like dozens, perhaps 100 cats, howling, screeching, crying, and moaning in a frightening, deafening, and eerie chorus. We expected to see cat fur flying everywhere. The distinct odor of cat urine in the air became a smothering stench. The putrid smell mixed in with the meows created a surreal vortex, causing us to trip over each other in our hysterical race for cover. The cats were so loud the kitchen windows shook and the ceiling fan began to turn from the intense vibrations. We ran into the house and slammed the door shut, fearing that at any minute Tailspring's army would launch a physical attack on us, but closing the door did nothing to quell that noise. Surely the police would be arriving any second in response to the neighbors' complaints about someone being noisy next door, but no one showed up, and the noise continued for nearly 10 minutes without pause. It finally ended as the sun first glimmered on the horizon. After the howling ceased, we just looked at each other in total disbelief. We uneasily made ourselves coffee and again asked Alexis just how she thought the cats had been the cause of her aunt's death. Sure, she had an unusual obsession, and it was quite possible that she was suffering from some kind of psychological dependence on her new family, but I still question why Alexis thought the cats had been the catalyst for Phyllis's demise. The strange event in the backyard remained unexplained, but we still couldn't make any solid link to Phyllis or her death. We got down to some hard-nosed research at this point and pored over the audio tapes for the next few hours. We narrowed the field down to 3 out of the 27 tapes that contained cat sounds, in which the recording sounded as though the cat noises were melding into human voices. One of the 3 contained continuous chatter that could have been the background TV dialogue, and one was the original tape that Alexis had presented to Savannah. This latter was the most convincing. The third suspicious tape was a recording of a ceremony I recognized as a bastardized version of Egyptian cat worship spell casting that evoked the goddess Pasht, Bast Mirror's sister. Black cats were considered especially sacred to Egyptians, so it made sense that Phyllis would be particularly enamored with them. As evidenced by the tapes and notebooks, Phyllis was dabbling in occult disciplines that revered cats as conduits of superpowers and secrets. I agreed with Alexis that her aunt might have been attempting to gain some of these powers from the cats in her home, but even at that, Phyllis had still been using the cats as a positive force, not for destructive purposes. Alexis maintained that the best she could offer was a gut feeling that all of this cat hocus pocus had an evil intent and that it ultimately caused her aunt's death. Don't you see that she was manipulated by some outside force that centered around these cats? It was unnatural the way that they would all come together when I entered the house, as if they were gathering and telling me not to intrude. It was also the way they looked at me, staring with unblinking green and yellow eyes that even glowed in the dark. I can't explain it, but they weren't normal house cats, and they were influencing my aunt's behavior. They made me feel very uncomfortable. You experienced that bizarre incident yourself last night, didn't you? How do you explain that? Alexis asked. I couldn't explain it, and the best I could do at the moment was to say that we all needed a break, so I excused myself to go out front for some fresh air. I spotted Roger, one of the next-door neighbors, puttering around on his lawn. I said hello and explained that we had stayed the night at Alexis's invitation. I then asked him if the cat racket had woken him last night. Racket? What racket? He asked. Didn't you hear the cats howling at each other right before dawn? I thought they'd wake the whole neighborhood, I said. No, not at all. I got up around 3:30. I have trouble sleeping, but I didn't hear a thing. In fact, I let the dog out in the back, and surely he would have heard cats howling, Roger told me. The neighbor went on to say that even when Phyllis was alive with her whole gang of cats in the house, he had never seen them outside, except for that big one. You mean Tailspring? I asked. I guess so. He was the leader. Funny thing though, Phyllis would never talk about him. She'd chatter about the other cats, but when I mentioned the big one I'd see in the yard now and again, she would just turn and walk away, almost as though he wasn't supposed to be mentioned, Roger told me. And so I hurried back into the kitchen and told Savannah and Alexis what the neighbor had said, that he hadn't heard the cats the night before. Alexis looked me straight in the eye and said, you see, we all heard it because we are in this house, and those evil cats have some kind of power here. I looked to Savannah for support, but I realized she was at a loss for any explanation as well. We had all witnessed a wild event, and Savannah and I had seen a huge black cat that Alexis confirmed from our description looked exactly like the missing Tailspring. But apparently we were the only ones who had experienced what happened. I was beginning to agree with Alexis that a paranormal event surrounding the cats was not impossible. And so when I returned to the yard to see if daylight uncovered any evidence of that cat battle we had heard in the night, there was absolutely no evidence of cat fur, nor any smell of cat urine, once again providing no answer. This was even more disconcerting considering that the house had been full of cats not 2 weeks earlier. I tried another approach and asked Savannah if she was experiencing any new psychic disturbances, thinking that her abilities might provide some kind of clue, but she said that there were no signs of anything. I concluded that whatever had caused last night's havoc had created it for one reason, to send us a message. Vincent's office was able to obtain the coroner's report, which stated that Phyllis had died from ingesting an undetermined toxin that ultimately stopped her heart. The crime scene investigators described the death scene as showing no evidence of a break-in or struggle. From all apparent indications, Phyllis sat in her bed surrounded by the photos of her cats, took a poison, and died a relatively peaceful death. Forensics have found quite a bit of cat fur on the bed and on Phyllis, but that wasn't unusual considering she lived with 9 cats. I reported these findings to Alexis as part of our investigation and told her that in most cases where a death occurs in an occult setting, we can find some ceremonial paraphernalia like candles, incense, photos, even blood sacrifice. Phyllis's scene was squeaky clean, but I gave Alexis a bit of information that I discovered while researching cat mythology and folklore. One of the most common myths about cats is that they are capable of stealing the soul of a sleeping human if they are permitted to place their mouth near the person's mouth or the person's face. It is said that the cat, especially the black cat, can literally take the breath from the person and inhale the human soul, thus causing death. The legend harkens back to the hysterical fear of black cats as being demons in the service of the devil. Myths also tell of how during the witch hunts of the 17th and 18th century, pure black cats were summarily destroyed. Only cats anointed with white spots, the finger of God, were spared from horrible boilings, burnings, and dismemberment. I didn't want to alarm Alexis. I just wanted to point out that over time there have been hundreds of myths and superstitions, both good and bad, linked to cats, and perhaps some of these tales were influencing her and possibly rationalizing her aunt's death in her own mind. Alexis could not come to grips with the fact that her aunt, who from all accounts loved life so much, would end it by her own hand. Alexis maintained that before the cats came into her aunt's life, she had never experienced the odd feelings of dread that permeated the house whenever she now entered it. She said that she had always felt the atmosphere was comfortable and loving when Arnold had been alive. At first, when Phyllis adopted Tailspring, Alexis tolerated it despite the fact that Tailspring would often hiss at her, especially if it appeared as though Phyllis was taking time away from him. "Oh, don't mind him, dear," Phyllis would say to Alexis. "He just gets a little jealous." But as time went on and the number of cats mounted, they literally took over the house. I dreaded going over there. Aunt Phyllis was not very kind when I got in the way of the cats. She would tell me I should watch where I was walking, be careful not to disturb them when they were sleeping, or bother the area where she placed their food. I was on constant guard not to annoy her precious cats, and that big one, Tailspring, with those hideous yellow eyes, stared me down as though I was some kind of intruder, Alexis said. We could not explain what had happened that night in Phyllis's backyard, and unfortunately, we never overcame Alexis' suspicions that the cats had forced Phyllis to take her own life by driving her mad or by using some supernatural power. In the days that followed, Alexis learned that her aunt's will was in fact enforced properly, and although she was offered her aunt's house to live in, providing she would care for the cats, she declined and appointed a caretaker. She said that all of the cats were back in the house, including Tailspring. "Those green eyes still give me the creeps," she said. I looked puzzled as we left Alexis, and as usual, Savannah perceptibly asked me what was wrong. "You have to look in your eye, Robert. I know you have something cooking in that head. Tell me what you are thinking now." I said that it was quite a stretch, but my research showed that some cat magic was aimed at melding humans with their feline pets into one entity, and that Phyllis might have been attempting to somehow metaphysically join herself with Tailspring. "Oh, come on, Robert, that's even a bit much for you," Savannah responded. I nodded my head in agreement, and then something dawned on me. I asked Savannah what color Alexis had said Tailspring's eyes were. "She said they were green," Savannah answered. "Yes, that's right, and that's what color the cat's eyes were at the night we saw him in the yard." "So what's the big difference, Robert? Don't you see? Alexis originally told us that Tailspring's yellow eyes frightened her when she visited her aunt. The cat we saw and the Tailspring that was recently found has green eyes." "Yes, that's right. The color has changed," Savannah said. "And what was Arnold's pet name for Phyllis?" I asked Savannah. Savannah recalled that Arnold called Phyllis Green Eyes, Tailspring's new attribute. And then that's it. That's everything associated with Chapter 9, The Cats Made Her Kill Herself. And this was part 2 of that chapter. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. First off, here you have another situation where it's more of an ambiguous ending. No real answers as to what those cats were. Were they supernatural? Were they paranormal? Were they mystical? Anything along those lines? No real answer. Just fainted hints and allusions here and there, especially with that frightful night associated with the cats apparently turning into hundreds of cats, all meowing at the same time, causing so much havoc and noise that it was shaking the house itself, but only them three could hear that stuff and nobody else. Not even the neighbor who was up at the time with the dog stated that there was any kind of quote-unquote racket. So what was that about too? And then there was the constant allusions to Tailspring and the almost link, the bonded link that it had with Aunt Phyllis. Because here you had a situation where Aunt Phyllis was heavily into trying to find some kind of power, some kind of link to be able to be with the cats. As it was described multiple times, as about unlocking the mysteries of the universe itself, maybe even some kind of immortality. And there she was using the cats and then apparently studying so much of that stuff within her home and then trying to find that missing link. Did she find it? It definitely seemed to allude to that, right? Towards the end, with Tailspring being the main cat, Tailspring looking at the group from outside, Tailspring causing that havoc, and now having those green eyes where before it was yellow eyes. I call a little bit of hesitation on that though, because I've seen cats, black cats, any other cats at night, and it's hard to discern what their eye colors are from afar because of the way that they reflect light automatically. Like I've seen cats in some of the haunted places that I've been at, regular cats, in other words, at night, just walking around, and there's no way I could tell what kind of color those eyes were because they're just refracting light. They look very bright. They look like they're glow-in-the-dark lights almost, but they're not. They're just regular lights. I just can't tell what those eye colors are. So I'm still very uncertain about that ending on there. And then also there's the notion that here you had Aunt Phyllis dying in a strange manner, but I still tug at the idea that it could have just been suicide. She just had her husband die, and she was missing him for a while, and she was elderly at the time too. There's the notion, you see that in history, recent stories or past, where when a longtime spouse dies, the other spouse generally doesn't live too long afterward, either naturally or unnaturally, like when it comes to suicide. So the investigators would have thought to themselves that it was just a natural suicide, and in this case, who knows? But yeah, I'd still seen it kind of stretched, like when it comes to Aunt Phyllis having found that link, being able to communicate with the cats. That's one other thing that seemed like a bit of a stretch too. I was hoping there would be more, like actual tape recordings that they would state that show actual conversations, human conversations with the cats, but nothing along those lines. But either way though, it's hard to see. Maybe she was a fan of all the allure associated with the mysticism of cats, but she never truly was able to do that type of magic. Like it was just something where eventually she thought she did, and maybe she committed suicide thinking that was the link, but who knows? Again, it's very ambiguous when it comes to this ending. But let me know what you guys think. Post in those comments below. Love to hear your thoughts about these quote-unquote evil cats and so on. The chapter even hinted about the idea of the cats sitting on your chest, basically mouth to mouth, breathing you in as you're sleeping, stealing your soul. I've heard of that as well. If that's the case, my beautiful cat Tum Tum has stolen my soul a long time ago because she always sleeps next to me. In fact, she insists on it. She always sleeps either right on top of me, right beside me, or right underneath the covers as well. And so my soul is probably long gone. Yeah, right. You know, it's not really something to consider. Like it's just a fable at that point. But yeah, at least with the regards to Aunt Phyllis, all of these theories, who knows? Let me know what the comments are, what you think about what was happening. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.